Welcome, 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 everyone, to the April Rock Game Dev Workshop. Oh, already having technical troubles. So if you're new to Rock Game Dev, hello, and thank you so much for dropping by. We have workshops on Twitch on the last Wednesday of every month. They're archived on YouTube for your viewing pleasure into the future, and you can also go back and see the archive of years and years of workshops that we've streamed in the past. We also have a bunch of other meetups, including the general meetup on our Discord next Wednesday. For a full list of events and other Rock Game Dev info, go to rockgamedev.com, and you can also check out our Facebook page, Discord, and Twitter. If, after watching this wonderful workshop today, you would like to host a workshop or you have an idea for something you'd like to see, chat with me after the talk via DM. You can find me at Sam_Camerata on Discord or Sam_Catamaran on Twitter. Tonight's workshop is by David Kilmer on Tengam, a slightly too honest postmortem. And there is a small content warning here about suicide and mental illness. I'll let David elaborate. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in chat. We will get to them as is appropriate. David, I will pass it over to you.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen here. And just let me know if it is... Oops. Just let me know if it is good.
You look good?
Okay. Hello, everybody. So this is Tengam, a slightly too honest postmortem. I'm going to try to make Google Slides work. So I just want to say in advance, I am... this is the first time I've given this talk. I usually don't have this set up. I'm sitting up here in my attic, and it feels very weird because I'm giving a talk, and yet there's no audience, and I'm surrounded by monitors. So, okay, let's get started. So first of all, I just wanted to say, as Sam said, there's a content warning for this. I'm going to talk frankly about mental health and suicide issues. I don't go into vivid detail about those topics, but I know they can activate painful associations for some people. They do for me sometimes. So viewer discretion is advised. I will let you know when there's one slide where I talk about that. And I will let you know when it will be the next slide. So if you want to watch the rest of the talk and skip that part, hopefully that will work out. Okay, so let's start out. Who am I? My name is David Kilmer. I am a hobbyist game developer, which means that I have a day job. And my day job is I am the director of data engineering for a nonprofit called Measures for Justice, which basically just means I'm a software engineer and a software architect, and I'm lead a team of developers. So far in my hobby, I've released 2 games, Reproduction Man and Tengam. They're both puzzle games, 2D puzzle games. Okay, so what am I talking about today? I am talking about, I'm doing a postmortem for Tengam, which was released on November 20th, 2020 on Nintendo Switch. Tengam is a Sokoban-like puzzle game, which means that it's basically a top-down game where you're trying to move boxes into a position in order to complete rooms. So I don't know if you ever played Sokoban, but that's the kind of puzzle game it is. In this game, you play as a warehouse robot, and the twist on the normal Sokoban mechanic, where you're just pushing boxes around, is that you have these magnets. You can see the picture. There's a plus magnet and there's a minus magnet on the other side, but you can't turn the magnets off, and so you are trying to push things around with your magnets. And it's kind of about, the game is kind of about like a small d disability where there's something wrong, and you're trying to work around it. And so the puzzles are based on this kind of frustration mechanic of trying to work around a thing that would be a lot easier if you could just turn your magnets on and off. Okay, so I'm gonna do this talk in 2 parts. The first part is a normal postmortem, And it's like every other postmortem, and it'll talk about what went well and what went not so well in the project. And then the second part is a slightly too honest part. And I'm going to talk about things like mental health and isolation and self-delusion and stuff like that. And so I'm going to kind of speed run the first part. um, I've heard a bunch of postmortems like this, and I feel like I can just kind of zip through it, and you'll get the kind of feel for it. Also, I wanted to mention that I just did not have the energy to like pick out meaningful pictures for all the slides. And so what you're going to see is every slide on everything is going to be a picture of one or both of my two cats who are now 2 years old. And the picture you're seeing right now is them on the very first day we got them. And their names are Trixie, who is on the left, and Kinsey, who's on the right. Um, Maybe we'll have a quiz afterwards and you can guess which one's which. See if you can figure that out. All right. So here's the normal postmortem. What went well? Um, so what I think went well was early on I talked with the people at Magic, Rob and John V especially, about pillars, having a pillar. So I had 3 pillars of my game, and the pillars were being bite-sized, being cute, and having really high quality or like hard puzzles, right? And so I kept those pillars in mind the entire way through the development, and I made decisions based on does that serve the pillars or not, and that went extraordinarily well. I felt like at the beginning, like was a little hokey, but it was extremely useful to have these kind of like rock solid principles to work from. That worked great. Um, the second thing that went well was having a risk analysis based workflow. And this is something that John Veneron turned me on to. Um, and the idea was that I kind of rated the risk along 2 axes. The first axis was like, um, how catastrophic would it be if it went wrong? And then the second was like, how likely was it to, go wrong? And then I created a score based on those things. I kind of weighted them, and then I arranged my work based on that. And that was an epiphany for me. And I've used it in a bunch of different areas in my life since then. So that's something that later on, if you want to talk to me about, um, I could I could do a whole talk on that, and or just have a whole coffee about that. So um, I think the third thing is the incubator program, not just the program itself, but the people involved and the structure of it that it provided, at least until the kind of pandemic kicked in. It was really great. I was actually taking a Friday off of work every week and going in, and it was really fantastic. I adjusted my scope early. I kind of had big ideas for the game, and very early on, I pulled down the scope to make it small, and I kind of made it. You could see that bite size became one of the pillars, and that kind of smallness really guided me and really helped me to complete the game. I stayed on track with a few exceptions that I'll mention, which I thought was really great. I learned about console dev. It was pretty much a dream come true to release a game on the Nintendo Switch. I have a Switch. I love my Switch. And it was so amazing to develop something for that platform and to learn about how it works. Um, I got to work with a professional artist. That was part of the incubator program, was that I got a decent grant to pay for an artist to do the work. The artist was named Shiloh Penfield. She's somebody who I actually knew through a mutual friend who does children's books. So she does all kinds of art, but she was a children's book artist for my friend's children's books, and I always just very much loved her stuff. So that was a real positive for me. And then the last thing was I actually released a completed game. So I think I could call that something that went well. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about what didn't go so well. Oh, that last slide that you saw, that was Trixie. This is Kinsey on Halloween. She's unhappy. I thought it was an appropriate picture for this. So what did not go so well? First, the pandemic and the state of the world in general. You know, eh, Last year was a year where I don't know if there was a more appropriate year to have the thought of like, why am I even doing this? because I'm making this little cute puzzle game and the world's falling apart. And there were a lot of times I asked myself, like, why am I doing this? What is the point? And it's really hard to work through that. So that was a big challenge for me. Um, Second, I didn't make enough use of resources. I think primarily with that, I guess in my brain, I'm thinking about Carly, who was offering marketing help, and I think I had one conversation with her before the the kind of quarantine period started, and I really felt like I could have. That was a relationship that I wish I had fostered. She's really incredibly smart and energetic, and had a lot of information to share, and I just kind of didn't follow up on that in a way that I could have. Um, oh, I guess I kind of covered that. I didn't foster relationships enough. I think there were other relationships there. Denny obviously comes to mind there. We talked, quite often when I was in there, but I feel like I could have fostered a kind of ongoing relationship um, with him, and yeah, that would have been a better thing. I didn't do pretty much any marketing for the game. I consider that a negative. I had planned to do it. I had, concrete plans for things I was going to do, and I pretty much didn't do any of them. The artist relationship wasn't as collaborative as I wanted it to be. I think part of that was, most of it was the fact that it was on a budget, and I was constantly feeling like anything that I would ask her, Shiloh, to do, I felt like I didn't want to do that and not pay for it. But all the money was allocated, and so I was constantly like kind of not wanting to ask too much, and so I was being really careful about asking for things. And I think that kind of I would have liked to have just had unlimited money and just not had that not be an issue for me. And I think part of it was most of it was really just how I handled that, and the fact that I hadn't really had experience with it, and so I didn't handle it as well as I could have. I was too cautious about cert. That's a whole story. The game was basically delayed for months. Really, it was done, but I had not completed the first page where you had to fill out a release date, a projected release date, and I didn't do that. And the reason I didn't do that was because I thought, oh, well, when I complete this page, now all of a sudden I'm committed to this thing, right? It turns out like you can change the thing constantly, but I just didn't know. I'd never been through the process. And so by the time I finally did it, then there was all this information they needed from RIT. And then that took a while because it had to go through like a whole kind of like the university and all that stuff, which, is all understandable. But if I had known and I kind of started that off sooner, that would have got moved along sooner. So like the last maybe 4 months, I had a game ready to release. And yeah. Okay, so that's the postmortem that you would normally hear. And so I want to kind of move a little bit into the next part of it. So I know it's trite to observe that postmortem is a weird term. I'm sure you've heard that in other postmortems. It's like, why do we call it a postmortem? But I think it's a good vehicle for what I'm trying to move into here in this part of the talk. Um, Without making too much of it, I think it's kind of mostly probably just dark humor. But I think it's worth thinking about why releasing something can feel like a death rather than like a birth. Okay, so I think part of it is that there's two phases to it. And in the first phase, you're creating this very private thing, and it's kind of like your thing, and it's in the room with you all the time, and you're thinking about it all the time, and it's kind of right in front of your mind, but nobody else's. And then it moves into this phase where it's now in the public, and you're not really doing anything to it, and it's such a stark difference, that I think it can be very unsettling, and it can feel kind of like a death in a way. I've got a friend who's a musician, and an extremely good one, who's released many records, and he tells me that every time he releases a record, he kind of goes through this period of just feeling like kind of awful. And I kind of feel like with this game, I kind of understand that a little bit, what that feels like to kind of put your thing out there in the world, and then it's kind of not yours anymore. Um, the other thing was, I think that limiting the scope of it and the fact that the cert process went on for so long kind of set up a situation where I just got to the point where I wanted to be done with the game. I didn't want to think about it. And it kind of got me into a negative place with thinking about the project. Like every time I had to go back to it, I was feeling kind of dread about it. I think another thing, and if you've released an indie game, you probably have felt this too, is that the world is kind of indifferent to things. Nobody knows about your game. Nobody really cares about your game. Um, I think this hurts in a way because the game is such a personal thing to you. And, like if if I had spent like if I had drawn a picture, right? Like I drew a picture and I like showed it to you and you looked at it and you'd be like, "Oh, that's cool, right? That's a cool picture." But I put like an hour into that or something, maybe. With a game, like I put months of my life into something. And so like, oh, that's cool kind of just doesn't kind of scale. It feels like to kind of the amount of effort you put in, and so it kind of feels hurtful in a weird way to like have people just not really care about the thing that you made. Um, Obviously, um, I think that that's a structural issue with the way the indie, you know, well, the way capitalism works basically, but the way that the indie game market works right now. We've got these platforms that are crowded. We've got like a kind of fight for attention, um, and there's different ways in which people kind of start playing games to get that attention, and the whole thing just kind of feels icky, honestly. And so I think those structural issues make it really hard to kind of feel good about the thing that you released because you're kind of also releasing it into this system that you feel like you're playing some kind of game with. And that just does not feel great. That's Trixie, by the way. So I think some games have found solutions to these problems, right? There are games where the things that I just mentioned in the previous slide are not as big of a problem. I think with early access and with having streamers and people making wikis, that you kind of are keep in touch with your game, and you kind of it's not just throwing it over the fence to the public world. You're actually kind of keeping in touch with it, and you're seeing it kind of grow up, and it's more like a birth, and you're seeing your child out there in the world doing things, right? I think there are games where they have content and feature updates where the release is just the very beginning of the game, where they're going to add new features, add content to the game over time, and so that's a process of engagement with the community and kind of has a feedback loop to it. And the game isn't just done when you release it. And then I think that there's the question of like the amount of time you put into it versus the amount of time the world puts into your game. And so there's a lot of games where like, I play Noida and there's a wiki about Noida, and the amount of time that people have just put into writing that wiki and updating it is probably, I wouldn't say it's more than, but it starts to rival the amount of time that the developer spent writing it. When people are writing reviews, they're streaming it, they're putting all this time into it. There's people who have spent, you know, 2,000 hours playing Noida, and that uh, feels like there's a kind of balance between at least between the amount of time that the world has spent on your thing and the amount of time you've spent on your thing. Problem is, those things don't apply to, none of those things, those solutions really apply to my particular game. So, translate translating into a marketing phase for me, to be totally honest, and I think that if I had really engaged in marketing a lot more than I did, the kind of margin that you're talking about there in terms of sales, even if I had done a really good job with it, um, would have been in the hundreds of people, hundreds of players, probably at most 1,000 additional sales from doing that. And so there's a question of whether that really, you know, putting that much of my soul into that and as much of the anxiety that it takes me to engage in that way with people, with strangers, would have been worth that. Also, if I had changed the game and made it kind of something that I did ongoing releases for, that would have made it a different game. Like I intentionally made this a small contained experience, and I could see adding levels to it maybe. But like, I don't think it's the kind of game that's going to have ongoing content or a kind of like where it's going to have a lifetime beyond. It is a little self-contained thing that I made, and so I didn't, doing that would have turned it into a different thing than what it was. The last one is part of being a little too honest. Um, I think there's three kind of indie games that are successful. The f- the first way you can be successful in indie games is that you can be an early kind of pioneer or a settler on a new platform. And so you've kind of arrived. There's not a lot of choices for the people kind of coming to that platform. And so you kind of have a prominent place just by being there early. And then the second is to be an established person. So, if you're, I don't know, Jonathan Blow or something, and you make a game, everybody's going to talk about it because you're Jonathan Blow and blah, blah, blah. And then the third way is to just make something really special. And this is where I think, a lot of people would argue with this. But I really do, after having thought about it a lot, I think that most of the indie games that are really successful that don't fit those other two categories are just very, very special in a particular way. Whether that's feel, whether that's the art style, whether it's a unique mechanic or whatever it is about that game, that it's just very, very special. And to be completely honest, I do not think, if I looked at Tengam as something that I came to as a person coming to a puzzle game, I would not call it special in that way. I think it's a solid game. I think it's a really good game. I think it's well designed. I'm very happy with how it turned out. But that doesn't make it that very special thing in the way that, like, say, Baba Is You is, where it just had a kind of blow your mind kind of concept or something like that. Okay. So that probably seems kind of a dark way of looking at the thing that I spent so much time making. Um, and if the creation phase of that felt like I just wanted it to be done, and the post-release phase felt like it was kind of a painful exposure to the world's indifference, then why why would I spend so much time making it? Um, and I think more basically, like, why why I have that dark take in the first place. Like, why do I feel that way about making a thing as opposed to feeling some other way? Why don't I just feel great about it or whatever? Um, so I'm going to talk about that in terms of how I see the world and how I react to the world. Um, and um, I don't want to generalize the things the way that I see the world to people in general. So I'm going to talk from myself. I'm going to just say that I do things, not that people do things. Um, but at the same time, I don't think I'd be like trying, kind of going through the anxiety of giving this talk if I didn't hope that somebody listening to this wouldn't like see themselves in some of the things that I'm saying. Um, so I'm going to uh, say that the next slide is the one with the content warning. So just this would be the next slide is the one that you want to skip if you are kind of sensitive to these issues about suicide and depression. Okay. So this is a very abridged biography of my life. First of all, I was a weird kid. As they say in central Pennsylvania, I'm different. I was sensitive, introverted, conflict averse. I always had the urge to make things and to take things apart from when I was a little kid. That is kind of so much a part of me that I can't really think of changing that about myself. That I, find meaning in making stuff. I'm small. If you've ever met me, I am very small. I am like 5'4". I got picked on a lot when I was a kid for that. Um, in addition to that, I was nerdy. I had really weird interests, and I got picked on for those interests. For example, I liked things like sewing and knitting. My grandmother taught me. I was a gymnast. I took ballet. And in the 80s in central Pennsylvania, those things were seen as girly. Um, so I was very familiar with a lot of the derogatory terms for gay people. Um, and I also was kind of gender bendery myself in the way that I dressed. I kind of rebelled against the way that people, treated me. And, I wore eye makeup and I kind of, they didn't call it cosplaying at the time, but I would, dress up as like, you know, female artists from the British bands that I liked and stuff like that. And, that was, I didn't make it any better for myself with that kind of stuff. There are cultural concepts for these things now, but, if they existed at the time, I didn't know about them. So the way I saw life was that I was just an outsider, that I didn't fit. And I always had depressive tendencies. I remember every year I would read Lord of the Rings, and then in the summer, and then I would spend like a month after that just feeling just despondent that I had to live in this kind of mundane, non-magical, grindy world. And so that was from a young age. But when I was 26 in '94, I was actually diagnosed with bipolar 1 disorder. Um, I actually spent a little bit of time in a psychiatric hospital at that time. And I was struggling with both depression and hypomania. In this talk, I'm going to talk about depression. That's the part that worries me the most. Hypomania actually feels really good, but it is actually also kind of dangerous. And you can do a lot of things that aren't good for you. But that's not where the focus is going to be in this talk. Um, Around 2001, I went into a period where my life basically went apart at the seams. I was clinically depressed for about 2 years, during which time I was hospitalized, I think a couple times. I had ECT treatments, electroconvulsive therapy treatments. I was on, as many as like 7 medications at one time. My marriage fell apart. I lost my house, lost my job, had to move to a city far away to like work. You know, that didn't work. I drank to kind of medicate myself. I ended up getting 2 DUIs from doing that, and so everything would like went to the very bottom over that course of that 2 years. And then in 2003, I attempted suicide. I am not going to go into the details of that, but one aspect of it is critical to like what I'm going to talk about today, and that is that I am literally alive today because I failed to properly execute a detailed and carefully planned project, right? The project of trying to kill myself. And I have never since regretted failing at something as much as I regretted that at the time. And at the same time, I have never, as I eventually did, felt as thankful to have failed at something. Um, so I want to let that sink in for a second because, like, I think it's hard to even get your head around um, just how much something like that, something that concrete and viscerally paradoxical, can fundamentally change the way you look at the world, right? To fail at something and to regret it that much, and to you know later on feel so happy about it. Okay, that's that. Um, so content warning over. If you, I don't know. Hopefully you can come back. Okay, so then to now. So it's 18 years later. I am still mentally ill. Um, but I haven't experienced clinical depression in a long, long time. I am currently on 0 medications. I experience joy regularly, like every day of my life. I have an extremely interesting job with responsibility. I provide financially for my family. Um, so, you know, I'm functional, right? I'm more than functional. I'm flourishing. But that doesn't mean that mental illness goes away. There are patterns, and those patterns are there. And in fact, they strongly persist, and they're probably part of the architecture of my brain. And, there are things that are dangerous and that I have to be vigilant about and pay attention to. And so I want to tell you what a couple of those are. There's a bunch of them, but I'm going to mention 3 that are kind of relevant here. So one of them is negative thinking, and it's like a negative feedback loop of rejecting things. So it affects me when I'm coming up with ideas and I'm kind of saying that's a bad idea, and I just get negative about whole things. Um, then there's the alienation isolation loop. If you've ever experienced depression, you've probably experienced this. As your motivation to engage decreases, as mine decreases, and then you kind of become isolated, and then I start to have behaviors that emerge that make other people uncomfortable about the way I'm behaving, and then they kind of want to not be around me, and then it creates more alienation and more isolation, and it just becomes a cycle that gets worse and worse. Um, and then a distorted perception of reality. This is a big deal because if when I was talking about my plan before, um, that not thinking that life is worth anything is most people, like, I would call that now a distorted perception of reality, but at the time it doesn't seem that way. And so the idea is that you don't know that you're perceiving the world in that way. Obviously these all overlap um, in a bunch of different ways. They're all manageable when I'm managing my mental health well, but they are constant dangers when that I can fall back into depression, and that things can send me into a tailspin, and it might make it very difficult to recover. So it's not something that goes away, and it's something that I always have to pay attention to. Okay. How did I make it from that point to now? So where I'm flourishing and I'm successfully managing things. So it would take a bunch of slides to a whole talk to explain that. They would be fascinating slides. They would be about cognitive metaphors and conceptual models and philosophical pragmatism and the formal structure of the Serenity Prayer. And the reason why I know what all those slides would be about is because I wrote them all and then I deleted them and I replaced them with this one slide. So you can thank me later for that. Um, the thing is, I have a weird brain and a weird set of passionate interests, and the way I think and talk about the world is weird. And it makes me a little sad, kind of, that I deleted those slides because I feel unable to communicate the things that I figured out in a way that kind of communicates or gets across how valuable they are to me and how useful they are. It actually kind of makes me feel like I'm a little like what people call a crazy person, to use a term I've heard a couple times. Um, but I'm going to try instead to just tell you, because I don't think the rest of what I say is going to make a lot of sense if I don't kind of just try to sum it up. So I'm going to distill a couple of the most important things that I figured out into pithy bullet points. If you ever want to talk to me about these, do reach out. These are things that I find very profound, um, that have really helped me a lot. So here they are. The first one is that things are processes. We view things as things. A rock is a thing. A feeling is a thing. Um, but things aren't things. Things are processes that happen and they change. And when I started thinking about things as processes, it changed the way that I viewed life completely. For example, happiness. We think of happiness as being a state that you kind of reach. It's a kind of a static thing in your brain that you get to. I don't believe that anymore. I think that happiness is an event. It's kind of like a process that culminates in an event, happiness event that kind of happens to you. And it can happen at random, right? Somebody can do something nice for you and it creates this happiness event. And your kind of goal is to create as many of those as you can, right? And it's true that they can happen it can happen to you randomly, but you can also become skilled at producing those events for yourself, right? It's a skill that you can develop to produce happiness events in your own life. And I'd go so far as to say it's your responsibility to develop that skill, right? So in a sense, like, the lesson for me is I'm responsible for my happiness. I have to develop the skill to produce happiness events for myself. The other one is that usefulness is greater than truth. I was a philosophy student and I'm always seeking this kind of truth. I was always seeking that. And it turns out that like that's not really as important as just having ideas and trying to use those ideas, those like mental models of the world and mental models of myself, and try to figure out how to do things. And if I have a bunch of overlapping models, different recipes and tricks and models and metaphors and tools, those are better than facts. Those are better than truths in my life. I pick them up and put them down as I need them. I use them and I see if they work. And if they don't work, I kind of tweak them and change them and see if they work. So I'm always on the lookout for new concepts and I'm always like looking for them and trying to use them. And I've got a whole toolbox full of them that I pick up and use when I need them. Um, the last one is, well, not the last one, but the second to last one is that um, everything has an inside and an outside. And I think when I'm trying to deal with mental health situations, the thing that I've gotten through therapy is this big focus on the inside. Like, what can I fix about myself? What can I change about the way I see things? What can I change about my behavior? How can I change my perception of things? How can I talk to myself or to, convince myself or reason with myself or whatever? But we have an outside too. We have an outside habitat that we live in. And very often, it is, I have found that that's the thing that has to be fixed. It's not just the inside, but it's the outside. And so every time I'm looking at a situation, I'm like, what is the inside and what is the outside? Right? And what can I fix by fixing the inside and what do I need to change the outside for? And that dichotomy has proven to be extremely useful. And a lot of it, this ties into the Serenity Prayer. If you've ever read it, there's a lot about what you can change and what you can't change, and some of that is an inside outside distinction that I think is really useful. The last one is that there are problems I can't solve. That's kind of a Serenity Prayer thing too, right? Like the wisdom to know the difference, right? There are problems that I cannot solve, and I need to kind of accept them. Okay. So I'm going to give one example of, since instead of 5 slides of examples, I'm going to give you one quick example of how I applied these ideas because it's going to be relevant a couple slides from now. So one of the things I came to realize is that I would never really get to stability in my life by myself. That I would actually need a close partner in my life to make that happen, right? The partner that I had um, was like helped me become unstable. And so I needed a partner to help me become stable because basically I was distorting reality, and without a kind of person to act as a kind of a North Star, I guess, or an orientation for me, I wouldn't be able to orient myself. Right. And so I needed somebody who I could trust, somebody who understood me, somebody who kind of saw the world the same way as me to some extent, and then somebody who could keep me oriented, who knew how to talk to me. So I'd spent a lot of time working on myself on the inside, but my habitat, like my outside, made it almost impossible to succeed. So I happened to find a person like that in my life, and that person also happened to want to be around me, which is very lucky. But there's also a skill in that, right? Like I also have to give myself a little bit of credit for finding that person, um, and recognizing that I needed them, and that they would be that good for me. You can see her in this picture with both little kitties. Okay, so now I'm going to focus on the reality distortion and self delusion part, because I think this is the most useful part of it. Like I said, I'm doing well, but I always have to be vigilant. And the thing I have to be most vigilant about is this distortion of reality that I do and seeing things in a weird way or a negative way. This is a scary thing. And basically, because of the way my illness works, I have a fundamental distrust of my perception of reality, right? And this comes in a bunch of different flavors. So one is like minimizing things and overblowing things and not being in denial. So it's like, I'll be okay with this, or this will be so good or so bad, or I'm not going to think about this. There's a projection of intent and feelings on others, projection of what people think of me or what people are thinking or what their intentions are. Um, there's rationalization and confirmation, kind of stuff of what I want to be true and convincing myself that those things are true. There's the cyclical negative thinking that I was talking about before, where I shut down ideas before they get anywhere. And then there's this wishful thinking and fantasy thinking. Um, you know, and the list goes on. I would say there are as many ways to lie to yourself as there are ways to think. Um, okay. So, but I think there's a couple patterns about the things that I just mentioned that stand out for me. One is that there are delusions about inside and there are delusions about outside, right? I have delusions about me and how I work, right? Like how I'm going to feel about something. And there's delusions about how other people feel or how the world works, right? Like if I think, well, the indie game market is a scam because blah, 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 right? Like I've got this kind of picture model in my head of what the world is, that it's out to get me or whatever, right? I don't actually have that opinion, but that's an example. Um, so there's both of those kinds, and making that distinction is often very helpful. And the other is that it's not always the case that I have a wrong concept of something, that I have a wrong mental model of a thing in my head, but that I just kind of change the degree a little, right? Like I think, oh, I know it's that way, right? But I'll be okay with it. I'll deal with it. It was like the marketing thing, right? Like I'll be fine. I'll be able to I'll push through it or whatever, right? And I don't really have a firm grasp of whether that's true or not. The one I want to focus on, though, is fantasy thinking. To me, this is a really special flavor of self delusion, and it's totally fascinating to me. It goes beyond wishful thinking. It's a kind of elaborate. It's like a daydream or an elaborate narrative that we kind of play out in our heads, right? Or I should say, I do. I think other people do too. Um, but it's really vivid and it's kind of a daydream that I have and I play out and kind of like think about. And a couple of things about this particular kind of thinking are very strange to me. One is that it's about both the inside and the outside at the same time, right? Like it's a story about myself and the world. That like if I were rich, and what would I do, right? And there's this story of me like, whatever. If I'm in a dead end job, it's me telling off my boss or whatever, right? Um, so that's about the world, the way the world is, and it's also about me and how I would act if the world were this way, right? The second thing about them is that I know that they're unrealistic, right? Like I know that it's a daydream. I know that it's not a believable thing that's going to happen to me, right? But yet I engage in it, right? Um, the, th- Another thing is that it feels embarrassing to share it, right? Like how often do I talk about my daydreams about these fantasies to other people? Now, to Joanne, yeah, I talk to her sometimes about them, but like generally, I feel embarrassed talking about them. They feel shameful to me, right? That they're childish or immature or something like that, right? And yet they're there, right? They're things that I engage in, and they're kind of almost like uh, an idealistic thinking, right? Like they're the world as I wish it were, and so they do drive my behavior and my goals in ways that I often don't face because I'm not, thinking about it directly. I feel embarrassed and shameful about it, right? So this is like cognitive science wise, this is mostly a mystery to me, right? I don't know why people do it. I don't know why I do it. I don't know what purpose it serves to our lives, whether it has some intrinsic benefit to human beings to engage in this kind of thinking. There are theories about it that I won't get into, why this might benefit us. But it is a great mystery to me and a very interesting thing. So I I'm gonna tell you my fantasy, right? This is the heart of the little too honest bit of this. So this comes back to Tengam. So I'm gonna tell you my fantasy about Tengam. This is the thing that I daydream about, right? So my fantasy is not about being rich. It's not about being famous per se. It is basically about being a part of a respected community, like a community of respected game designers, right? And there are two particular things that really kind of like always play a big part in these daydreams. One is that is the idea of being somebody whose ideas and opinions are sought out and valued by other people, right? Being important, being worth listening to, uh, in general, but particularly by like other people who design, who are considered good game designers, right? And so I want to be part of this like important people community. Like when I tweet about game design, I imagine people like listening to me and talking about what I say and writing blog posts about it and stuff like that. And then the second part of it is actually being friends with people like that, and thus having, basically access to their brains, having relationships with them, um, and being able to interact with them. All the daydreams that I have about Tengam and about game design and development involve those two things at the core of them. I don't think I can bring myself to be more specific than that. This is kind of a little too honest and not a lot too honest. But you can see, I think, how it's delusional, right? For one thing, I've done two games. Like, I haven't done enough game design to have even, you know, considered having earned that kind of respect, right? And even and more than that, like, even though I might actually develop those skills, and you know, I hope to. It's pretty obvious that I'm never gonna like be buddies with like Gwen Frey or Alan Hazelden, and or like be a guest on designer notes or something like that, right? Like that's just not something that's probably going to happen to me. But I think it's valuable to not um, shrink away from it because I'm embarrassed of it. Like I have these daydreams for a reason, right? And in fact, like I think about it, and wanting people to value my concepts and my opinions and my ideas kind of makes a lot of sense, right? Because it's a kind of antidote to the uncertainty about my grasp of reality, right? Like it's a way of, if I don't feel confident in my grasp of reality, that feedback that I get, oh yeah, what you say is important, what you say is good and smart, is solidifies that, right? Like stabilizes that for me. And so it makes sense in a weird way that that would be my daydream, as opposed to like making a ton of money, or you know having paparazzi follow me around or whatever, or being a Twitch streamer or something. I don't know. Um, so I think it's weird, right? That it's worth thinking through those delusions and those daydreams and fantasies, because I think that it's at the core of what motivates me, right? And so I try not to shy away from them. Okay, and then I have like regular old fashioned self delusions, and I had a bunch of them about Tengam, I think, as a project. Um, and it's weird how few of them to me are straight up misconceptions, and how many of them are just like degree based things. And I kind of feel a little good about that, because it feels like I think, you know, I guess I think like I've kind of figured some things out, right? If I'm just minimizing or overblowing things, like I'm kind of a little bit on track, right? So here's oh, I see a comment. Oh, good. I'm so glad, Sam, to hear that. Um, we have to go to coffee and talk about these things, because I know you're interested in concepts and mental models too. So we should talk about that. Um, okay. So one of my self delusions was I overestimated my ability to power through the marketing part. Right? I thought, yeah, I can handle it. I know I feel anxious about it. I don't like it. Um, but when I did the application for the incubator program itself, that felt like marketing, right? Like I was selling my project to the incubator program, and it felt really good, right? Like I felt like I did a good job with it. I felt like I sold it. I felt like it was cohesive and it made sense, and it felt good. I felt like I knew what I was doing. I also knew the people that I was applying to, and that probably helped. And I knew that the promotion stuff after I released the game, or near the release of the game, would be tough, but I thought I could kind of make myself do it. And I was wrong about that. I just ran out of gas completely on it. The other thing was I think I deluded myself about how much I cared about sales, like about getting or how much that would relate to meeting my goals. As you can know from the previous slide, like nothing in my fantasy has anything to do with sales. I was like if I could sell 5 games and still like be part of this like elite community or whatever, I'd take it, right? And I think if I would have taken the time to think that through, I would have at least kind of tried to map how trying to market and get, even 1,000 more sales would have kind of taken me closer to the kind of success that I wanted. But I didn't engage in that because I wasn't realizing that that was a delusion. This was an actual misconception. I had the wrong concept of the market, right? I think I've got a much clearer picture of it now. And I don't really blame myself now for it because, like, I don't like the market. Like, I think capitalism, like, hides itself and it hides what it is. Um, and so I don't feel really that bad for misunderstanding it in a way. I don't think you still see people, like, tweeting about the indie market and saying, like, widely different things about it. And I think it's really hard to figure out, and I don't really honestly feel like it's a thing that I'm not into the stock market. I think it's an awful thing personally. And so, like, I have trouble even thinking about it because I just find it distasteful. So that's weird. But that was the thing that I think I've kind of forced myself to think about a little more and try to figure out why I don't like it so much. I misconceived the artist relationship. I think I didn't understand what that would be like, and I really love the art that I ended up with, but I didn't realize I would be as anxious as I was about the budget and about like asking for things from Shiloh. I underestimated the negative loops and how much that would slow me down. I got into a whole thing where I was like, I need to design levels. I only have like 8 levels. And it took me so long before I finally just like sat down and just spent like 2 days in a row designing levels. And that slowed me down. And that was just negative thinking. Um, I think the kind of gap between releasing the game, I needed more happiness events to be happening, and I think the pandemic made that very hard. When I was taking this to, like when I took this to the Game Fest and stuff, I kept having these little happiness events where I'd watch people play and it would feed back, or I would show something to somebody and, I would show, like, how I did an animation trick or whatever, and somebody would be like, "Whoa, that is really cool," and that would just give me this little happiness event that I could kinda carry the energy from that. And I needed those more often than what I had, and so I just kind of ran out of happiness about it, basically. I think I minimize how different my tastes are. I think I could kind of ask people to raise their hands if I was in a real room, but like, you know, just, as a rhetorical question, like how many of you play Sokoban like puzzle games? Probably not a lot. I like things that have very small groups of people, and so that makes the project a little different. It's harder to show to people and have them be excited because there's a lot of people who just don't play the kind of thing that I'm creating. Okay, and then I think the last thing was the biggest one. I minimized how I minimize that developing a solo game is an isolating thing. I mean, I knew that. I'm doing this by myself, but I minimized it. For a huge portion of my free time, I was engaging in a process that involved just me. Other people could support me, and many people did, but I had to take the full burden of the schedule and the risks and the decision making. When I had an success, people could say like, "Oh, that's awesome," but there was nobody who was sharing that success with me and trading the energy of having something good happen with me. And for me, that isolation is not just like not fun. That is a dangerous thing, right? So if I feel like I have to finish this project and that project is isolating me, I am now in a zone of that being dangerous for my well-being. And so minimizing that is a big, big mistake. Um, yes. Okay. So we're on the second to last slide. How am I doing for time? It's 8 o'clock. I think I'm okay. I've only got a couple minutes left. So solutions. I do not have complete solutions. And maybe some of these problems are not solvable problems. But I think my fantasies that I mentioned and my delusions point towards some sensible ideas that I have. One is that partnership equals health. that kind of, I told you the story about my life partner, and I do share a lot of my game dev things with her, but she is not game deving with me. I believe that I need to have a partner in my game dev work. I don't know if that's a solvable problem. I think if I were in college and I had, I wasn't, that it wasn't that the kind of people that would partner with me are, already have jobs and kids and stuff like that. It's hard to find somebody my age or in with my interests to just say, yeah, I'll work on something for free. But I think there are some solutions that might make this work. For example, I could work on somebody else's project instead of working on the one that I want to work on. I could say, hey, I'll work without pay for you on your thing. And then maybe that'll turn into something better. A lot of that, it's also about finding the right person, somebody who really, I think that was true of my life partner, and that would be true of my kind of game dev partner. My ideal person would be somebody that would be hard to find. So that's a tough problem, but I think that's one that I do want to solve before I do another project. I don't think I want to do another like long alone thing. And so one solution to that is to make smaller things than 10 gam was, right? Like even smaller, something that takes a month. And I think that's a way of building up the skills and kind of taking me towards that mastery that helps me have opinions that people could consider important or worth listening to. I could get better at it by doing that. But it doesn't require that kind of commitment or that risk of isolation that I would have with a bigger thing. And it also, I think it increases the chances of finding somebody special that I can uh, finding the special game that I was talking about that, you know, if I build a lot of little things, then I'm much more likely to find that special game that I'm like, okay, this is worth marketing. This is worth doing the whole thing for. Another thing is to opt out of the market altogether. I was telling you how I don't like the market. I just don't like the way platforms work now in the modern world. Um, but the beauty is that I'm a hobbyist and I can opt out if I want to. I can make free things. I can make unmarketable things. I can make weird things and I can put them out in the world and not charge for them. And so that's an option for me. And I have to realize that that's a lucky thing for me. A lot of people aren't in those positions. A lot of people are looking for jobs in the industry and are doing things that they would prefer not to be doing to make it work. Some people are really taking a lot of risks and trying to make a studio work and stuff like that. And I don't have to take on those risks. Like I have a good job and I have enough free time that I can spend doing this, and that's a big privilege. So that's something that I want to think through how to make the best of that and how to kind of give back with that. The other one is instead of trying to market things, use a publisher. I was saying that I felt really good about applying to the Incubator Program. Well, that's very similar to applying to a publisher. And honestly, the one of the only things that I like about the indie market right now is there are certain publishers that I think are really doing good things. Raw Fury is one that comes to mind for me. They've made like 3 or 4 games that I just think are amazing. The way that they curate what they select to be released is amazing. The way they do it, the way they build community is amazing. And they're doing a thing that I'm not good at and that I don't want to be doing. So I can see myself pitching to somebody like them, pitching to some small publisher like them in the future and doing it that way. And also like using a partner who is more interested in those things as well. Okay. So this is the end. Um, One thing I want to say is I focused a lot about regrets and about self delusion and mental health and isolation and all that stuff. But as I mentioned before, I've got a really weird relationship with regret. I don't want to go back and redo any of the things in Tengam. Like, I don't want to do anything over. I don't want to sit with my mistakes and be sad about them. Like, regret is an event too. It's an event, it's a process that is the process of wanting to do something different the next time you do something. I want to learn and I want to make more things, whatever they happen to be. And I want to try out my solutions that I am talking about in this talk, right? So my feeling at the end of the project is a happiness event, right? I remember a lot of great things about this project. I remember the brainstorming session I had with Rob and John V that broke me out of a negative loop of rejecting my mechanics ideas. I remember having an epiphany of understanding the risk thing that that came from John and a couple conversations with him. I remember the sense of control that that gave me over what I was doing. I remember the first time I ran my game on a Switch, and I literally like shouted in the little room up at Magic Studios, and just yelled, and I saw somebody look in the window like, "Are you okay?" Because I'm like, "This is running on a Switch." Um, I remember the first time I got the character sketches back from Shiloh and just being like, "Oh my god, this is amazing. This is Tengam, right? This is what she looks like." And this is not something I would have ever thought of in a million years. Um, and I also remember at the very end of it, after like all of this trouble getting the thing released, that I was able to kind of finagle it so that I could set the release date on my daughter Soren's birthday, and that just like how good that felt for that to happen. So I mean, that's just some of them, but that's a lot of happiness events um, that I got to feel. And so I do want to kind of just close by saying um, thank you to all the people who helped me, all the people who, were there during this process. Thanks. So I guess we can do, I don't know if you want to do questions or if I kind of went too far over to do that. I'll let you jump in and say that. Yes, that was awesome.
Sorry about that. I didn't realize I was muted. We have plenty of time for questions if folks have them.
Awesome. So I'm watching the chat here, and I actually, I'll see if anything pops up.
I will ask one question real quick via voice
Sure.
while we wait for questions, and that is, you have these two gorgeous kitties. Do they have any sort of like grounding effect for you? Because I know we recently got a cat, and it's been tremendously helpful for me.
Yeah, I mean, there is a reason why these little babies are the pictures that I shared. This just choosing the pictures for this thing was nearly impossible because we have so many. We did a weird thing when we got these kitties. We got them 2 years ago, and we got a pair of siblings. It was kind of my idea, I think, that that they might like cuddle together and stuff, and they do. And there are so many pictures of them where you can't even figure out where one cat begins and the other ends. But yes, they bring me happiness and kind of like anchor me every day in this kind of just, I don't know what you'd call it, like just this kind of like, it's a happiness event every time I see them, every time I look at
Yeah.
them. And so I get to experience that every day. And that's awesome. And just really, yes, big, humongous yes.
I'll ask another question because I have lots of them.
Okay.
So you talked a little bit about like postmortem um, and like death, kind of when you like the death of a game when you launch it. But you also talked about how you were very kind of ready for the game to launch by the time that it finally came to that point. So did you experience any sort of like grief or kind of emotions we typically associate with a death or with a loss, or was it mostly a relief?
It to me, it felt like relief. And I happened to have like, I think that was partially just luck. Um, so we're all isolated in the house, and it's me and Joanne, my wife, and my daughter Soren, she's my youngest daughter. I have two. Emma's my oldest. And so Soren's living with us while she's finishing college. And I think it was the day after the release or the day of the release, she played through it. And so I got to watch her playing it, and that just felt really good. And so I think that kind of took me over. And then I was very busy at the time, and I just kind of stopped thinking about it a lot. In fact, I don't think I've checked sales in a long time. I think I checked them the first day, and I don't think I've checked them since. So like, I don't feel like it was like that for me, right? Like, because I've had people close to me die, and there's this kind of constant chiming of their absence in my life, and that there wasn't that with Tengam. I was just like ready for it to be gone, and so it didn't feel like that. Here's a question from Strange Kitha. I apologize for the pronunciation. Do you feel like you could ever create a game based on my experiences with mental health, or do I think that would be too personal? I don't know the answer to that question. It's funny because I write fiction as well, and very often I kind of skirt the themes. Like I write a lot of fish out of water stories about people who don't quite fit in the world. But I have kind of written a little bit about depression, but I've never like put anything out into the world. And so I feel afraid of it. I will say that. Um, and I feel worried that my insights, like when I was kept trying to be careful about saying this happens to me or this is how I feel, as opposed to this is how people with depression experience the world. I feel weird about that. Um, Trying to kind of say something general about what it means to experience depression. So I do worry about it, and I am scared about kind of how vulnerable it makes me. I feel like this was kind of a first step towards just talking about these things. I don't think I've talked about the things that I mentioned in this slide, like are not things that people outside of this chat room really have heard from me. So hopefully, I hope if I feel like it's going to do some good for somebody, I think I will probably eventually do that. That's a good question. Um, BC asked, "How do I plan to approach working on a team?" I'm not sure. I kind of have a team at work, and so that's helping me think through it. And I feel like there's something that happens. We have this like amazing team at work. We've got like these brilliant people, just like even on just my little team. And it feels like everybody's got like a kind of a thing that they're good at, and that finding a good kind of balance for the team is a matter of one thing is like finding a process that lets you get to consensus where everybody feels heard and everybody feels and everybody gets to like actually like contribute. And I struggle with that too on the teams that I work on, but that's what I think the kind of ideal is. And then the other thing is kind of letting people find their niches and letting them kind of grow within those niches. So I think those are two of the things that I'd really like to kind of find. Um, and so like part of it is finding somebody that balances you, right? Like so if I had found somebody who was like in my life partner, if I had found somebody who had like the same problems with getting a grip on reality, on having a grasp of reality that I did, that probably wouldn't have gone well, right? So you've got to find somebody that complements you in some way. So I'd like to kind of find a team that works that way, if that makes sense. That's a good question too. Yeah, Sam saying consensus is always a bit of effort, and exponentially more so the more team members you have in my experience, but fostering a team of complementary skills and personality is a huge important thing, right? That and I think that's true. I was just in an interview today and I was talking to somebody who I was saying that basically being a leader is essentially the process of orchestrating consensus, right? And I'm not perfect at it by a long shot, but I think that that's what happens, right? When you're doing it right, like you're a good conductor of consensus. And if people are making their arguments, even if you end up disagreeing at the end of it, everybody got to you kind of got people to talk to their points. And so everybody understood why it turned out the way that it did. And understanding why it has to turn out the way that it did is kind of a way of reaching consensus, even if you don't necessarily understand or agree with the decision 100%, right? Like you saw how it got there, you were part of how it got there, which is really cool, I think. I have a lot to learn about leadership, but yeah, I'm really interested in learning more about that stuff. All right. I'm starting to feel, are there more questions? I'm starting to feel like I get this kind of ringing in my ears when I've talked so much that I'm not breathing enough. And I'm feeling that right now.
We
So,
could certainly be done if you'd like.
yeah, if there's anything else, I'm glad to answer, but all
If
right.
people do have more questions, either because they're watching the archive or we just don't get to them tonight, can people get in touch with you easily in different places? Where do you recommend?
Yes, and I did not put this in my slide, but I'm at David_Kilmer on Twitter, and that's usually the best way to reach me. I'm also on Discord here. If you search for D Kilmer here, you'll find me. And really do feel free to reach out, like about mental health stuff, about cognitive science and concept stuff, about whatever. I feel like, part of talking about this is the fact that mental health is still stigmatized and still a big deal in our society. And so if you're going through stuff like that, I've been through a lot of stuff, and I'm always willing to listen and talk about stuff. And thank you so much, RGD, for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on and talking so open and honestly about your experience, not only in Tengam, but kind of as a person developing games, because I think that that's really important. Um,
Awesome.
so with that, I think we'll be done for the night. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Be sure to check rockgamedev.com and the Facebook page for the rest of our events, and we'll have another workshop the same time, last Wednesday of every month, next month. See you all then. Bye.